14 children vanished from the Sacred Heart Orphanage in Pennsylvania between 1862 and 1865. They weren't adopted, nor were they transferred. They simply disappeared from all records, as if they had never existed. Local Protestant families were suddenly seen with Irish Catholic children working their farms. These children bore the unmistakable marks of institutional life and spoke with heavy accents. Yet, when questioned, the families' stories never aligned. Recently uncovered letters exchanged between the Mother Superior and Philadelphia's bishop reveal a horrifying truth. These children weren't missing. They were sold. Before we delve further into the story of Sacred Heart Orphanage, know this channel isn't for everyone. It's only for those brave enough to confront the darkest episodes of American history. If you're prepared to uncover secrets that powerful institutions have tried to bury forever, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And I want to know, comment below and tell me what state you're watching from. Are you brave enough to hear what really happened to those 14 innocent souls? Let's uncover the truth behind Sacred Heart's missing children together. The truth of Sacred Heart's missing children begins not with their disappearance, but with the desperate circumstances that brought them to Pennsylvania's rolling hills in the first place. Lancaster County in 1862 was a tapestry of prosperity and prejudice. The fertile farmland yielded abundant wheat and corn, feeding Union soldiers fighting in the Civil War. This made Protestant, German, and English farmers wealthy beyond their ancestors' wildest dreams. However, prosperity brought its own problems. With so many young men off marching to war, farms desperately needed workers during the crucial planting and harvest seasons. The labor shortage was becoming critical, even as government contracts promised unprecedented profits to those who could meet the demand. Into this landscape of opportunity and desperation came Sacred Heart Orphanage, established in 1859 by the Sisters of Mercy from Philadelphia. The 3-story brick building sat on 40 acres of donated land just outside the small town of Strasburg. Its Gothic Revival architecture stood like a Catholic fortress amid the simple Protestant meeting houses and Lutheran churches that dotted the countryside. The building's pointed arches and cross-topped bell tower made it impossible to ignore, which troubled many local residents. Mother Superior Catherine O'Malley, a sharp-eyed woman of 45, had arrived from County Cork 20 years earlier with nothing but fierce determination and unshakable faith. She spoke with the lilting accent of her homeland, but her business sense was purely American. Under her leadership, Sacred Heart had grown from housing a mere dozen children to accommodating nearly 60 by 1862. The orphanage took in Irish Catholic children from Philadelphia's overcrowded tenements, as well as the offspring of Irish immigrants who had died building the Pennsylvania Railroad through the treacherous mountain passes to the west. The children ranged in age from 5 to 16, their faces bearing the distinctive pallor of institutional life and the hollow-eyed wariness of those who had learned early that the world offered no guarantees. They wore identical gray wool uniforms, simple dresses for the girls, plain trousers and shirts for the boys, and attended daily mass in the orphanage's small chapel. The older children helped with cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the extensive vegetable gardens that helped feed the institution. Sister Agnes Flanagan, the orphanage's treasurer and Mother O'Malley's closest confidant, kept detailed records of every penny that entered or left Sacred Heart's coffers. Her ledgers, written in a precise Irish hand, documented the constant struggle to keep the institution solvent. The Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia provided some funding, but wealthy Catholic donors were few in Pennsylvania, and the ongoing war had made charitable giving more difficult. By 1862, Sacred Heart was operating at a significant deficit, a fact that kept Mother O'Malley awake during the long winter nights. The local Protestant community viewed the orphanage with suspicion that bordered on hostility. The Know Nothing movement had stirred up anti-Catholic sentiment throughout Pennsylvania in the 1850s, and the Civil War had done little to ease those tensions. Protestant ministers regularly preached about the dangers of papist influence in their communities, and local newspapers printed letters complaining about the orphanage's foreign children and their allegiance to Rome. Some farmers refused to do business with Sacred Heart entirely, while others charged inflated prices for grain and supplies. It was into this atmosphere of religious tension and economic pressure that Father Michael Brennan arrived in the spring of 1862. The diocese had sent him to serve as Sacred Heart's chaplain and to help Mother O'Malley navigate the increasingly difficult financial situation. Father Brennan was a different sort of priest, ambitious, charming, and possessed of a merchant's eye for opportunity. Unlike the elderly Irish priests who had served the orphanage previously, Brennan had been born in Philadelphia and understood the delicate balance between Catholic principle and American pragmatism. At 38, Father Brennan cut an impressive figure in his black cassock, his dark hair always perfectly combed, and his shoes polished to a military shine. He spoke without an accent, having been educated at St. Charles Seminary in Philadelphia, and he possessed the rare ability to make both Catholics and Protestants feel comfortable in his presence. The local Protestant ministers found him surprisingly reasonable, and the wealthy German farmers discovered that he understood their concerns about labor shortages and wartime production demands. What none of them realized was that Father Brennan's understanding ran deeper than mere sympathy. He saw opportunity where others saw only problems, and he began to develop a solution that would benefit everyone involved, except, perhaps, the children of Sacred Heart Orphanage. The first sign that something was changing came in late May 1862, when Mother O'Malley announced to the staff that several of the older children would be placed with local families to help with spring planting. This wasn't unusual in itself. Orphanages had long arranged for older children to work as farmhands or domestic servants. However, Sister Agnes noticed that the arrangements were being made personally by Father Brennan, rather than through the diocese's usual placement procedures. When she asked to see the paperwork, Father Brennan assured her that he was handling all the documentation himself to avoid burdening the diocese's overworked administrators. The morning of June 15, 1862, dawned gray and humid, with thunderclouds building over the Susquehanna Valley. Timothy Walsh, a red-haired boy of 14, who had been at Sacred Heart for 3 years, was helping Sister Margaret tend the vegetable garden when Father Brennan approached with a well-dressed Protestant gentleman whom he introduced as Mr. Ezra Hoffman, a prosperous wheat farmer from Lancaster Township. Timothy had been expecting this moment for weeks. Father Brennan had spoken to him privately about the possibility of working for a good Protestant family who would treat him fairly and pay him wages that would help support the orphanage. The boy was eager to contribute. He had watched Mother O'Malley's worried expressions during meals and had overheard hushed conversations about unpaid bills and dwindling supplies. If working for a Protestant farmer could help Sacred Heart survive, Timothy was willing to make the sacrifice. Mr. Hoffman examined Timothy with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock. He checked the boy's hands for calluses, asked him to lift a bag of grain to test his strength, and questioned him about his experience with horses and farm equipment. Satisfied with what he saw, Hoffman nodded to Father Brennan and counted out $45 in gold coins, an enormous sum that represented more than most workers earned in 3 months. "The boy will work through harvest season," Hoffman said, his Pennsylvania Dutch accent thick with authority. "He'll live in the barn loft with my other hands, and I'll send him back in November when the work is done." Father Brennan blessed Timothy and assured him that he was performing a great service for both his faith and his country. The Protestant farmer needed workers to produce grain for Union soldiers, and Timothy's labor would help feed the brave men fighting to preserve the Union. Sister Agnes watched from the kitchen window as Timothy climbed into Hoffman's wagon with his few possessions bundled in a cloth sack. Something about the transaction troubled her, though she couldn't quite articulate what it was. Perhaps it was the speed with which everything had been arranged, or the fact that Hoffman had paid in gold rather than the paper currency that most people used during wartime. But Father Brennan seemed confident in the arrangement, and Mother O'Malley had approved it. So Sister Agnes pushed her concerns aside and returned to her ledgers. 3 days later, 16-year-old Margaret Connolly disappeared under similar circumstances. She was taken by Mrs. Sarah Zimmerman, the wife of a prosperous German farmer, ostensibly to work as a household servant and help care for the Zimmermans' infant twins. Margaret was a bright girl with a gift for languages. She had learned to speak Pennsylvania Dutch from German immigrants in Philadelphia and could read Latin well enough to assist at Mass. Mrs. Zimmerman paid $60 for Margaret's services, explaining that she needed help urgently because her regular servant had run off to Philadelphia to work in a munitions factory. The pattern continued throughout the summer of 1862. Every 2 or 3 weeks, Father Brennan would arrive at Sacred Heart with another prospective employer, always Protestant, always wealthy, always in desperate need of immediate help. The amounts paid grew larger as the harvest season approached and labor became even scarcer. 13-year-old Patrick Murphy went to work for a merchant family in Lancaster for $50. 15-year-old Bridget O'Brien was placed with a banker's family in Columbia for $75. 12-year-old Sean McMahon, despite his young age, was taken by a mill owner who claimed he needed a boy to help with his horses. By September 1862, 8 children had been placed with Protestant families, and Sacred Heart's financial situation had improved dramatically. The orphanage was able to pay off its debts, purchase new winter clothing for the remaining children, and even add a small addition to the building to accommodate more orphans from Philadelphia. Mother O'Malley praised Father Brennan's success in finding good homes for the older children, and the Sisters of Mercy began to relax their concerns about the institution's future. However, Sister Agnes continued to feel uneasy about the arrangements. She had noticed that none of the placed children had written letters back to the orphanage, which was unusual. Children who had been placed in previous years had always maintained contact with their friends and the sisters who had cared for them. More troubling still, when she tried to visit Timothy at the Hoffman farm, she was turned away at the gate and told that the boy was too busy with harvest work to receive visitors. The breaking point came on a cold October morning when Sister Agnes encountered Mrs. Hoffman at the Lancaster market. The woman was purchasing supplies for her household, and Sister Agnes approached her to ask about Timothy's welfare. Mrs. Hoffman looked confused and claimed that she had no idea what Sister Agnes was talking about. She insisted that her husband had never employed any orphans from Sacred Heart, and that their farm workers were all local men who had been exempted from military service due to their essential agricultural work. When Sister Agnes pressed the issue, Mrs. Hoffman became agitated and suggested that the sister was mistaken about which farm Timothy had been sent to, but Sister Agnes was certain. She had watched Timothy leave in Ezra Hoffman's wagon, and she had Father Brennan's word that the boy was working at the Hoffman farm. The contradiction made no sense unless someone was lying. That evening, Sister Agnes confronted Father Brennan in his small office behind the chapel. She demanded to know the truth about Timothy and the other children, and she insisted on seeing the written agreements that documented their placements. Father Brennan was initially dismissive, suggesting that Sister Agnes was confused and had misunderstood Mrs. Hoffman's comments. But when the sister threatened to write directly to the bishop in Philadelphia, Father Brennan's demeanor changed entirely. His friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold stare that seemed to look right through her. "Sister Agnes," he said quietly, "you must understand that these are complicated times. The war has created opportunities that good Catholics must be willing to seize for the greater good of our faith and our institution. Those children are safe and well cared for, and their sacrifice is ensuring that Sacred Heart can continue to serve God's purposes." "What sacrifice?" Sister Agnes demanded. "What have you done with those children?" Father Brennan leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. considering his words carefully. I have found them homes where they can contribute to the war effort, while learning valuable skills from Protestant families who appreciate their labor. In return, these families have made generous donations to Sacred Heart that have secured our future. It's an arrangement that benefits everyone involved. But Mrs. Hoffman said what she needed to say to protect her family's privacy. Father Brennan interrupted. The families who have taken our children value their discretion, and we must respect that. Some arrangements are best kept confidential, especially during wartime. Sister Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Father, are you telling me that you have sold those children? The word hung in the air between them, like a curse. Father Brennan's eyes narrowed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an unmistakable threat. I'm telling you, sister, that you have a choice to make. You can continue to serve God faithfully at Sacred Heart, focusing on your duties and trusting in the wisdom of your superiors. Or you can pursue questions that will bring nothing but trouble to this institution and everyone in it. The bishop sent me here to solve Sacred Heart's problems, and I have done exactly that. I suggest you remember where your loyalties lie. The winter of 1862 to 1863 passed in an atmosphere of uneasy silence at Sacred Heart Orphanage. Sister Agnes continued her duties as treasurer, but the joy had gone out of her work. She found herself studying the ledgers with new eyes, noticing patterns that had previously escaped her attention. The donations that had appeared so providentially during the summer all came from the same source, a vague entry labeled placement services that corresponded exactly with the dates when children had been taken from the orphanage. She began to understand that what she had witnessed was not charitable placement, but something far more sinister. The children hadn't been adopted or even indentured in the traditional sense. They had been sold to Protestant families who needed workers but didn't want to pay full wages to adult laborers. The transactions were disguised as charitable arrangements, but the substantial payments made it clear that Sacred Heart was running what amounted to a human trafficking operation under the cover of religious charity. The realization tormented Sister Agnes through the long winter nights. She had taken vows of obedience to her religious superiors, but she had also taken vows to protect the innocent children in her care. The 8 children who had disappeared the previous summer had been her responsibility, and she had failed them utterly. Their trust had been betrayed, not by strangers or enemies, but by the very institution that had promised them safety and care. Mother O'Malley seemed genuinely unaware of the true nature of Father Brennan's arrangements. She spoke proudly of the orphanage's improved financial situation, and praised the priest's success in finding good homes for the older children. When Sister Agnes tried to raise concerns about the lack of correspondence from the placed children, Mother O'Malley dismissed her worries with the explanation that Protestant families often discourage their workers from maintaining ties to Catholic institutions. Those children are beginning new lives, Mother O'Malley said firmly. We must trust that God has guided them to where they need to be, and we must focus on caring for the children who remain with us. But Father Brennan was already planning to expand his operation. As spring approached, he began conducting what he called evaluations of the orphanage's children, assessing their physical condition, work skills, and temperament. He paid particular attention to the children who had recently arrived from Philadelphia, newcomers who had few friends at the orphanage and whose disappearance would be less likely to cause disruption among the remaining children. The priest had also begun cultivating relationships with a broader network of Protestant families throughout Lancaster County and neighboring counties. The success of his initial placements had created demand for more workers, and the approaching planting season promised to bring even higher prices for healthy, trainable children. Father Brennan spoke of expanding operations to include children from other Catholic institutions in Pennsylvania, creating what he called a regional placement service that would benefit multiple orphanages while meeting the labor needs of Protestant farming communities. Sister Agnes realized that she was witnessing the birth of a systematic trade in human beings, one that exploited both the desperation of Catholic institutions and the prejudices of Protestant employers. The Catholic orphanages needed money to survive, and the Protestant families needed workers who could be obtained more cheaply than adult laborers. Father Brennan had found a way to profit from both needs while maintaining a veneer of religious respectability. The psychological impact on the remaining children was subtle, yet unmistakable. They had observed that the older children who departed for placements never returned, nor did they correspond, unlike those placed in previous years. Whispered conversations within the dormitories revealed a growing unease regarding their own futures. The children began to perceive reaching their teenage years not as a milestone toward independence, but rather as a harbinger of their potential disappearance. 10-year-old Mary Catherine Donovan, who had been particularly close to Margaret Connolly, started experiencing nightmares of being abducted by strangers. She would awaken in the middle of the night, screaming, crying out for Margaret, and imploring the sisters not to allow the Protestant men to take her away. When Sister Agnes attempted to comfort her, Mary Catherine clung to her desperately and whispered, "They're not coming back, are they? Margaret and Timothy and the others, they're never coming back." That question haunted Sister Agnes, as she increasingly suspected Mary Catherine was correct. The children who had been taken were not being prepared for independence, nor were they being afforded opportunities for improved lives. Instead, they were being consumed by a system that valued their labor above their very humanity. Once they entered that system, they effectively ceased to exist as individuals possessing rights and futures of their own. As the snows receded and the initial signs of spring emerged in the orphanage gardens, Sister Agnes reached a decision that would ultimately reveal the full extent of Father Brennan's operation. She began to maintain a clandestine record of every child who was placed, meticulously documenting their names, ages, physical attributes, and the families who had purportedly taken them. She also initiated discreet inquiries among recent arrivals from Philadelphia regarding any siblings or friends who might be residing at other Catholic institutions within the region. Her discoveries confirmed her gravest fears, unveiling that Sacred Heart's missing children were part of a far broader network of exploitation that extended throughout Pennsylvania and potentially beyond. In March of 1863, as the Civil War entered its bloodiest phase, Father Brennan received an unexpected visitor who would ultimately dismantle his carefully constructed network. Bishop Francis Kendrick of Philadelphia arrived unannounced at Sacred Heart, ostensibly to conduct a routine inspection of the diocese's rural institutions. However, Sister Agnes swiftly discerned that the bishop's visit was anything but routine. Bishop Kendrick, a stern and intellectual man who had ascended through the church hierarchy by melding theological erudition with administrative precision, had been receiving troubling reports from other Catholic institutions across Pennsylvania. These reports detailed children vanishing from orphanages and schools without proper documentation, as well as suspicious financial gains that coincided with these disappearances. The pattern had finally become too glaring to disregard. Prompting the bishop to personally investigate Sacred Heart, Father Brennan greeted the bishop with elaborate courtesy, leading him on a tour of the orphanage's improved facilities and extolling the Sisters of Mercy for their dedication to the children's welfare. He presented the financial records with pride, elucidating how his innovative placement program had transformed Sacred Heart from a struggling institution into a paragon of efficiency and sustainability. The bishop listened impassively, his pale eyes absorbing every detail of the orphanage's operations. However, when Bishop Kendrick requested to examine the documentation pertaining to the children who had been placed with local families, Father Brennan's confident facade began to crumble. He explained that the records were stored securely in Lancaster and could not be retrieved immediately, promising to make them available within a few days. Yet, the bishop insisted on reviewing them prior to his departure the following morning. That evening, as Father Brennan labored feverishly in his office to fabricate the requisite documentation. Sister Agnes made a decision that demanded immense courage. She approached Bishop Kendrick privately, requesting a confidential meeting. The bishop, having served in Pennsylvania long enough to recognize the telltale signs of institutional corruption, consented to hear her out. Within the orphanage's modest library, illuminated only by a solitary oil lamp, Sister Agnes divulged everything she had unearthed regarding Father Brennan's operation. She presented her secret records of the missing children and recounted her encounter with Mrs. Hoffman at the Lancaster market. She articulated her escalating suspicions concerning the true nature of the placement services and her anxieties regarding the well-being of the children who had been taken from Sacred Heart. Bishop Kendrick listened in somber silence as Sister Agnes detailed what amounted to a systematic slave trade operating under the guise of Catholic charity. Upon the conclusion of her account, the bishop sat quietly for several minutes, contemplating the ramifications of what he had heard. Finally, he spoke in a voice imbued with absolute authority. "Sister Agnes, what you have revealed to me constitutes one of the gravest scandals in the history of our diocese. If your suspicions are substantiated, Father Brennan has not only violated his sacred vows, but has also committed crimes against both church and civil law. I want you to understand that pursuing this matter will likely result in the closure of Sacred Heart and inflict significant damage upon the church's reputation in Pennsylvania. Are you prepared for those consequences?" Sister Agnes met the bishop's gaze unflinchingly. "Your Excellency, I took vows to serve God and protect the innocent. Those 14 children entrusted us to safeguard them, and we failed them. If Sacred Heart must close to prevent this from befalling other children, then that is God's will." The bishop nodded slowly. "Very well. Tomorrow morning, I will confront Father Brennan with your allegations. I want you to be present as a witness, and I want you to bring every document you have compiled. We will ascertain the truth of this matter, regardless of the cost." However, Father Brennan had not attained his position without cultivating a keen instinct for self-preservation. He had observed the private meeting between Sister Agnes and Bishop Kendrick, and he correctly interpreted the sister's avoidance of his gaze during evening prayers. That night, as the orphanage slumbered, Father Brennan gathered his most crucial documents and what funds he could carry, and he vanished into the Pennsylvania countryside. By morning, Father Brennan was gone, along with nearly $300 from Sacred Heart's treasury and all records of his placement operations. He had left behind only a brief note, asserting that he had been summoned to serve as a military chaplain and would be departing immediately for the front lines. The note made no mention of the missing children or the families who had purportedly taken them in. Bishop Kendrick was incensed by the priest's escape, but he was also relieved to have confirmation that Sister Agnes' allegations were accurate. Father Brennan's flight served as a tacit confession, empowering the bishop to take immediate action to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy. He dispatched investigators to locate the missing children and initiated the process of determining which other institutions might have been complicit in similar operations. What they unearthed over the ensuing weeks was a web of corruption that had exploited scores of children across multiple counties. Father Brennan had been collaborating with at least 3 other priests and had forged connections with Protestant families throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. The operation had generated thousands of dollars in illicit profits. While condemning vulnerable children to lives of unpaid labor and social isolation, however, the investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. Several of the children who had been placed could not be located at all. Some of the families who had purchased them had relocated to other states, taking the children with them and leaving no forwarding addresses. Others asserted that the children had absconded or succumbed to illness, but could furnish no documentation to substantiate their claims. The trail of at least 6 children, including Timothy Walsh and Margaret Connolly, had grown completely cold. The realization that several children remained missing transformed Bishop Kendrick's investigation from an internal church matter into a criminal case that would ultimately involve both state and federal authorities. The bishop recognized that some of the missing children might have been transported across state lines, thereby rendering their disappearance a federal crime under the laws governing interstate commerce and kidnapping. In April of 1863, as the investigation broadened, Sister Agnes received an unexpected visitor who would provide the first tangible breakthrough in locating the missing children. Jacob Stoltzfus, a young Mennonite farmer from Lancaster County, arrived at Sacred Heart in a state of manifest distress. He had heard rumors regarding the investigation and had come forward with information that he avowed would assist in locating at least some of the missing children. Stoltzfus explained that his family had been approached by Father Brennan the previous summer concerning the possibility of taking in a Catholic orphan to assist with farm labor. The Mennonites, as a peace church, had maintained neutrality during the Civil War, but they had also experienced severe labor shortages as their young men departed Pennsylvania to evade being drafted into military service. Stoltzfus' father had been tempted by Father Brennan's proposition, but had ultimately declined, as the arrangement appeared to contravene Mennonite principles regarding equitable treatment of workers. However, Stoltzfus was aware of other Mennonite families who had accepted children from Father Brennan, and he harbored increasing concerns regarding the treatment of those children. The Mennonite community was tightly knit and largely self-governing, but rumors had begun to circulate regarding families who were exploiting their orphan children as virtual slaves and preventing them from maintaining any contact with the outside world. "There is a family in our district," Stoltzfus told Sister Agnes and Bishop Kendrick, the Yoders, "who took 2 children from your priest last summer, a boy and a girl, Irish children with red hair. The boy would be about 14, the girl maybe 12. They work from dawn till dusk in the Yoders' fields, and they live in a shed behind the barn. My wife has seen them at the creek when she goes to fetch water, and she says they look like they are afraid of their own shadows." Bishop Kendrick immediately dispatched 2 investigators to locate the Yoder farm and corroborate Stoltzfus' claims. What they discovered substantiated the worst fears regarding the fate of the missing children. The Yoder family had indeed purchased 2 Irish children from Father Brennan, Sean McMahon, and his younger sister Ellen, who had been taken from Sacred Heart on the same day. Despite being only 11 years old, the children were living in conditions that barely qualified as human. They slept on straw in an unheated shed, labored 16-hour days without pay, and had been forbidden to speak to anyone outside the Yoder family. They had been informed that Sacred Heart had been destroyed in a fire, and that all the sisters had perished, leaving them with no one to turn to for help. The Yoders had also threatened to turn them over to Union Army recruiters if they attempted to flee, asserting that Irish Catholic children were considered enemy sympathizers and would be imprisoned or shot. The discovery of Sean and Ellen furnished the first concrete evidence that the placed children were being held in conditions akin to slavery. However, it also raised terrifying questions regarding the other missing children. If the Yoders were willing to treat children so brutally, what might have transpired with the children who had been sold to families with even fewer scruples or community oversight? The investigation assumed renewed urgency when Bishop Kendrick received a letter from the Catholic Diocese of Baltimore, reporting analogous disappearances from orphanages in Maryland. The letter described a network of priests and religious officials who were selling children to Protestant families throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, with some children being transported as far south as Virginia and North Carolina. The operation appeared to be far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected, and Father Brennan had been merely one participant in a regional conspiracy. As federal marshals joined the investigation, they began to uncover evidence of a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating for at least 2 years. The conspirators had devised a system for identifying vulnerable children, creating fraudulent documentation, and transporting them across state lines to families who were willing to pay premium prices for workers who could be controlled completely. The network had generated tens of thousands of dollars in profits, while condemning hundreds of children to lives of forced labor. However, the most disturbing discovery came when investigators located a farm in Chester County, where 3 former Sacred Heart children had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The farmer asserted that the children had succumbed to fever during the harsh winter of 1862 to 1863. But the local coroner's examination revealed evidence of severe malnutrition and physical abuse. The children had been interred in unmarked graves behind the farm's barn, their deaths unreported to any civil or religious authorities. The farmer, a prosperous grain merchant named Samuel Crawford, initially denied any knowledge of how the children had died. However, when confronted with the coroner's evidence and threatened with murder charges, he broke down and confessed to the investigators. He admitted that he had purchased the 3 children from Father Brennan for $200, intending to employ them as unpaid farm laborers until they reached adulthood. However, the children had been weakened by their institutional upbringing and had struggled to adapt to the arduous conditions of farm labor. Crawford claimed that he had attempted to care for the children when they fell ill, but he had been unwilling to summon a doctor, fearing that questions would be raised regarding their presence on his farm. By the time he realized how dire their condition had become, it was too late to save them. Rather than report their deaths and face difficult inquiries regarding how he had acquired them, Crawford had buried the children surreptitiously and destroyed all evidence of their existence. The discovery of the 3 deceased children sent shockwaves through the investigation and transformed public perception of the case. What had initially been regarded as a corrupt but relatively minor scandal had evolved into a narrative of systematic child abuse and murder. Newspapers throughout Pennsylvania began clamoring for the immediate apprehension of everyone implicated in the network, and political pressure intensified for a comprehensive federal investigation. Just when we believed we had witnessed the full extent of this horror, the investigation took an even darker turn. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened when federal authorities finally tracked down Father Brennan and uncovered the true scope of his network. Federal marshals apprehended Father Michael Brennan in October 1863 at a Union Army camp near Gettysburg, where he had been serving as a chaplain under an assumed identity. The priest had cultivated a beard and claimed to be Father Patrick Murphy from the Diocese of Boston, but his distinctive Pennsylvania accent and his familiarity with Latin liturgy eventually betrayed his true identity. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, Brennan initially maintained his innocence, asserting that he had been providing a valuable service to both the Catholic Church and Protestant families in need of workers. However, the weight of evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal investigators had documented at least 47 children who had been sold through his network across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. They had traced financial records demonstrating that Brennan and his collaborators had generated over $15,000 in profits from their trafficking operations, an enormous sum that represented more than most Americans earned in a decade. Under intense interrogation, Father Brennan finally confessed to the full extent of his operations. He revealed that the network had been his own creation, conceived from his observation that Protestant families were willing to remit substantial sums for workers who could be controlled completely. He had persuaded other priests to participate by contending that the profits would assist their struggling institutions in surviving the economic pressures of wartime. The children, Brennan explained with chilling matter-of-factness, were selected based on their age, physical condition, and social isolation. Older children who could perform strenuous labor commanded the highest prices, while younger children were sold to families who needed domestic servants or assistance with lighter agricultural tasks. Children who possessed no relatives or friends outside the institutions were preferred, as their disappearance was less likely to be noticed or investigated. These children had no future anyway, Brennan told his interrogators with stunning callousness. They would have spent their lives in poverty, probably dying young from disease or industrial accidents. At least this way, they served a useful purpose and contributed to the survival of Catholic institutions that could assist other children. The priest's confession divulged the locations where some of the missing children had been taken, leading to the rescue of 11 more former Sacred Heart orphans who were found laboring on farms across 3 states. However, 6 children, including Timothy Walsh and Margaret Connolly, remained unaccounted for. Some had been sold to families who had subsequently moved westward, taking the children with them to territories where federal authorities had limited jurisdiction. Others had been sold to families who alleged that the children had either died or run away, but could furnish no credible evidence to support their claims. The investigation also unearthed evidence that several of the children had been sold to families who had no intention of treating them as workers or servants. 3 children had been sold to a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who retained them as personal servants in his mansion, compelling them to work without remuneration while prohibiting them from any contact with the outside world. 2 others had been sold to a Virginia plantation owner who employed them as laborers alongside his enslaved African Americans, engendering a grotesque situation where Irish Catholic children were held in conditions identical to chattel slavery. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that some children had been sold to families for purposes that transcended mere labor exploitation. Federal investigators discovered evidence that at least 3 children had been sold to buyers who were specifically seeking young servants for what the documents euphemistically described as personal service. The investigators' reports, which were sealed by court order and remained classified for over a century, suggested that some of the missing children had been sold into sexual slavery. The full horror of Father Brennan's network became apparent when investigators realized that the priest had been operating what amounted to a catalog system for child trafficking. He had maintained detailed records of available children, including their ages, physical characteristics, work skills, and temperaments. Prospective buyers could peruse these records and select specific children who met their particular needs, with prices fluctuating based on the child's age, health, and capabilities. Mother Superior Catherine O'Malley, when confronted with the evidence of what had been transpiring under her authority, suffered what witnesses described as a complete nervous collapse. She had genuinely believed that Father Brennan was assisting in placing children in good homes, and the revelation that she had been an unwitting accomplice to child trafficking shattered her mentally and spiritually. She was relieved of her position and spent the remainder of her life in a convent infirmary, never again able to speak coherently regarding her time at Sacred Heart. Sister Agnes, despite her efforts to expose the conspiracy, was consumed by guilt over her failure to act sooner. She had suspected that something was amiss from the outset, but her deference to religious authority had prevented her from taking decisive action until it was too late to rescue most of the children. She departed Sacred Heart shortly after the investigation concluded and dedicated the remainder of her life to working with freed slaves in the South, seeking what redemption she could find through service to other victims of human trafficking. The trial of Father Brennan and his collaborators became one of the most sensational criminal cases of the Civil War era. The federal prosecutor charged them under the newly enacted laws against interstate trafficking in human beings, arguing that their crimes were analogous to the slave trade that the Union was fighting to abolish. The defense attempted to portray the defendants as misguided religious officials who had been endeavoring to assist children in finding better lives. But the evidence of systematic exploitation and abuse was too overwhelming to disregard. During the trial, testimony from rescued children revealed the full extent of the trauma they had endured. Sean McMahon, the boy discovered at the Yoder farm, testified that he had been compelled to work 18-hour days during harvest season and had been beaten with a leather strap whenever he exhibited signs of exhaustion. Ellen McMahon recounted sleeping in an unheated shed during the winter, sometimes awakening to find ice on the blanket that covered her. Other children testified regarding being forbidden to speak their native language, being denied medical care when they became ill, and being threatened with violence if they attempted to contact their former caretakers. The testimony that exerted the greatest impact on the jury emanated from 12-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan, who had been sold to a family in Baltimore County, Maryland. Bridget described being forced to work as a domestic servant from dawn until midnight, sleeping on the kitchen floor, and being provided with only scraps of food to consume. When she had attempted to flee, she had been apprehended and confined to a root cellar for 3 days, without food or water. The family had informed neighbors that she was a distant relative who was intellectually impaired and necessitated constant supervision, thereby precluding anyone from questioning her treatment. Father Brennan displayed no contrition during the trial proceedings. When afforded the opportunity to address the court prior to sentencing, he delivered a protracted speech in which he justified his actions as essential for the survival of Catholic institutions during wartime. He contended that the Protestant families who had purchased the children were furnishing them with opportunities for gainful employment and Christian instruction that they would never have received in Catholic orphanages. He avowed that his sole regret was that he had not been able to assist more children in discovering productive lives beyond the institutional system. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Father Brennan was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, while his collaborators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The judge, in delivering the sentences, characterized their crimes as a betrayal of everything that civilized society holds sacred, and expressed particular indignation at their exploitation of religious authority to perpetrate what he deemed the most heinous form of slavery. The Sacred Heart Orphanage never recovered from the scandal, which shattered its reputation and decimated its population. The Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia shuttered the institution in 1864, transferring the remaining children to other orphanages throughout the state. The building was sold to a Protestant denomination and converted into a seminary, but even that endeavor faltered within a few years. Local residents reported that the building seemed cursed, with strange accidents befalling anyone who attempted to operate a school or religious institution on the site. For decades after the scandal erupted, investigators persisted in searching for the 6 children who had never been found. Timothy Walsh, the red-haired boy who had been the first to disappear, was purportedly sighted working on a farm in Ohio in 1867. However, by the time authorities arrived to investigate, the family had relocated, leaving no trace of their destination. Margaret Connolly, the bright girl who had been fluent in multiple languages, was allegedly spotted working as a servant in an affluent household in Virginia, but she vanished again before she could be contacted by rescuers. The other 4 missing children, Patrick Murphy, Bridget O'Brien, and 2 younger children whose names had been deliberately expunged from Father Brennan's records, simply dissipated into the vast anonymity of post-Civil War America. They may have been transferred repeatedly from family to family, their identities altered, and their histories erased. They may have perished from overwork, abuse, or neglect, their deaths unreported and their graves unmarked. Or they may have survived to adulthood, forever burdened by the trauma of their childhood exploitation, yet unable to reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them. The psychological impact on the children who were rescued was profound and enduring. Many grappled with what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, anxiety attacks, and difficulty in forming trusting relationships with authority figures. Several of the rescued children absconded from the new institutions where they were placed, preferring to take their chances on the streets rather than risk being betrayed again by religious authorities. The scandal also exerted far-reaching effects on Catholic-Protestant relations in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States. Protestant communities that had previously harbored suspicions of Catholic institutions now possessed concrete evidence to substantiate their fears regarding papist corruption and foreign influence. Catholic leaders, for their part, struggled to restore trust with both their own congregations and the broader American public. The case became a rallying cry for anti-Catholic sentiment that persisted well into the 20th century. Federal authorities leveraged the Sacred Heart case to justify expanded oversight of religious institutions and stricter enforcement of laws governing the treatment of children in institutional care. New regulations mandated detailed documentation of any placement arrangements and prescribed regular inspections of families who took in children from orphanages. These reforms helped prevent similar large-scale trafficking operations, but they arrived too late to aid the 14 children who had already vanished from Sacred Heart. The question of what became of the missing children continued to haunt the investigators who had worked on the case. Federal Marshal James Crawford, who had spearheaded the initial investigation, devoted years to pursuing rumors and alleged sightings, but he never unearthed conclusive evidence regarding the fate of any of the missing children. In his final report, filed in 1870, Crawford wrote, "The trail of these innocents has grown cold, and I fear that the truth of their ultimate fate may never be known. They were consumed by a system that valued their labor above their humanity, and they paid the ultimate price for our failure to protect them." Sister Agnes' secret records, which had been instrumental in exposing the conspiracy, were preserved by the Diocese of Philadelphia and eventually deposited in the Pennsylvania State Archives. Researchers who examined these documents in later decades were struck by the meticulous care with which she had recorded each child's name, age, and personal characteristics. Her notes revealed a woman who had genuinely loved the children in her care and who had been tormented by her inability to rescue them from exploitation. The most poignant entry in Sister Agnes' records was a notation she had inscribed beside Timothy Walsh's name: red hair, freckles, scar on left hand from kitchen accident, dreams of being a schoolteacher, afraid of thunderstorms. Last seen June 15th, 1862. God, forgive us all. Similar personal details appeared alongside each child's name, creating a portrait of individual human beings who had been reduced to commodities in Father Brennan's trafficking network. The physical structure that had housed Sacred Heart Orphanage stood vacant for nearly a decade after the scandal broke. Local residents recounted witnessing lights flickering in the windows at night and hearing the echoes of children's voices emanating from the empty rooms. Whether these phenomena were supernatural manifestations or merely the products of guilty consciences and collective trauma, they served as a perpetual reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within those walls. In 1874, the building was ultimately razed by its new owners, who asserted that the structure was unsound and posed a danger to public safety. However, denizens of the area knew the true impetus for the demolition. The building had melted into a monument to shame that no one could bear to behold. The bricks were carted away and employed to construct a new courthouse in Lancaster, where they continue to serve as a foundation for the administration of justice. The land where Sacred Heart had once stood was eventually transformed into a public cemetery, and a small granite marker was erected in 1925 to commemorate the children who had been exploited and lost. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of the innocent children who suffered here. May they find in death the peace that was denied them in life." However, even this modest memorial proved contentious, with some residents contending that it would only serve to remind people of a tragedy that was best consigned to oblivion. Father Brennan served 18 years of his 20-year sentence before perishing in federal prison in 1881. His death certificate cited the cause as pneumonia, but prison records intimate that he had been in declining health for several years due to what physicians termed melancholia, a condition that may have reflected a belated recognition of the enormity of his transgressions. He was interred in an unmarked grave within the prison cemetery, his name deliberately omitted from any memorial records. The other priests implicated in the trafficking network received varying punishments, but all confronted the ultimate sanction of defrocking by the Catholic Church. Numerous attempts were undertaken to locate the families who had purchased children from the network, but many had relocated to Western territories where federal authority was circumscribed. The children who had been sold to these families simply vanished into the vast expanse of America's burgeoning frontier, their fates forever obscured. The Sacred Heart scandal ultimately precipitated significant reforms in how religious institutions operated within the United States. New laws mandated routine government inspections of orphanages and other facilities that housed children, and stringent documentation was required for any placement arrangements. These reforms assisted in preventing comparable large-scale trafficking operations, but they exacted a toll in the form of heightened suspicion and regulation of religious charities that had previously functioned with complete autonomy. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Sacred Heart tragedy was the realization that institutional authority, whether religious or secular, could not be trusted implicitly when the welfare of vulnerable children was at stake. The case demonstrated that even the most esteemed religious figures were capable of committing monstrous crimes when personal ambition intersected with institutional power and social prejudice. The 14 children who disappeared from Sacred Heart Orphanage between 1862 and 1865 were casualties of a confluence of circumstances: wartime desperation, religious bigotry, economic opportunity, and moral depravity. Their individual narratives were subsumed within the broader chronicle of American expansion and conflict, but their collective tragedy endures as a testament to the price that innocent individuals pay when society neglects to safeguard its most vulnerable members. This mystery reveals to us that even our most trusted institutions can harbor the darkest secrets, and that the most innocent among us can fall victim to those who would exploit their vulnerability for profit. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in Pennsylvania's rolling hills? Leave your comment below, sharing your thoughts about whether some of those children might have survived and lived under different names. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of American history and want more stories about the secrets hidden in our nation's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. The truth is always more complex and more terrible than we imagine, and there are countless other stories waiting to be told. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another mystery that powerful people hoped would stay buried forever.